Well, I'll just start. I'm a professor of innovation and learning sciences. What that means is I spend a lot of time, and I've spent about 3 decades, focusing on how people learn. And I would probably go even back a little bit and say that I focus on unlocking human potential. But a lot of the work that I'm doing now looks at formal learning environments where that occurs. And I think the question, the positioning of what we're doing is unlocking human potential has become in such sharp contrast to what schools are offering in the classroom. And when we think through what is the goal of schools, and if we really focus on this question of unlocking human potential and we think about the way these classrooms are arranged, there's a real mismatch. And then we wonder why people aren't finding a sense of purpose, aren't finding value, don't see it as relevant. And I think it's because we're focusing on the wrong target, which is content as opposed to unlocking potential. Cool. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm also, one thing I should say, in a school called the Future of Innovation in Society, right here. And it's very interesting. At Arizona State University, we used to have normal School of Engineering, School of Law, School of Business. In the last 3 years, we've started to rip down those structures and recreate more impact-focused entities, and we're kind of redesigning the university. Our president calls it a design experiment, and we're trying to figure out, as a state institution who's trying to help unlock the potential of Arizonans to improve Arizona, what does our institution need to look like to do that well? So I'm in a school called the Future of Innovation in Society, and we have engineers, we have doctors, we have science fiction writers, we have policymakers, all working together to think about what is the role of technology, but really to think about what is the role of people thinking about how they're going to use technology to create a better future for themselves. And so when you stop focusing on disciplines and you start focusing on what you want people to do, the questions shift. And you stop thinking about the bits and the bytes, what we know in our textbooks, and start thinking about what do we want to enable people to do. And if we could switch schools to be more like that, which businesses have done, the technology industry, which is no longer really even called the technology industry, they call it tech-enabled services or tech services industry. It's no longer about products. It's about services even when you design products. We just did a lot of work for Intel. They used to be about Intel Inside, right? We saw that Intel Inside sticker everywhere. They're now about We Power Experience. The focus is shifting from what we are to what you can be and what you can do. And schools have not made that shift. Schools are still focused on what our content is and how you consume that more efficiently. And even the way we're leveraging technology, it's about arranging content to be consumed. It's not about enabling people to live better lives on the surface of it. The expectation is if you consume our content well, you will later have a great life. So part of what I want to talk about is how are we thinking about learning environments? How are we thinking about arranging formal institutions the way they present information to people? And most importantly, I want to talk about how are we positioning people? How are we positioning the learner? Because that's where the real problem lives, in my mind. I've been lucky enough over my life to engage unlocking human potential in many different spaces. I've been a desert survival instructor where we bring people out into the desert and we help them build new insights to what they're doing wrong in the real world. Very cool in the desert, not a lot of transfer back to the real world. I've been a drug counselor where I'm working with recovering addicts, trying to think through how they deal with their addictions, and more importantly, how they re-engage life. And what we're seeing in the addiction world is it used to be on stop, you bad person, stop drinking. Let's get you to say no, to not pick up that next drink. And now there's a huge emphasis on helping them create new positive opportunities in their life. It's a very different focus when you think of a deficit model. The problem is their addiction to the chemical. When you start thinking about what I'll call an invitation model. The problem is they're not building enough different experiences where they're engaged in different lifestyle. And we're seeing a real switch. There was a wonderful TED Talk where they were looking at some of the early studies on addiction with rats. They'd put rats in these cages, and the rats would go up, and if they would kind of get addicted to the substances, they would keep coming at it, and they would call that addiction, and they would look for ways to get them to stop doing it. But what they found more recently in some of those exact same studies is that when you put other rats in that cage, and you put other things to do in that cage, many of the rats never go and get addicted. They start doing other things. They start building other opportunities and have different kinds of relationships with rats. And when you have different kinds of relationships and positive experiences in your life, the chemical addiction was no longer as compelling as we thought it would be. I've been a teacher in various environments, a professor of learning, and some of my kind of biggest joys is a father of 3 boys, which is really interesting as they're getting older. When they were younger, I could kind of say, no, don't do that. What are you doing? If I was really busy, stop, right? But if I was spiritually centered, I could kind of ask them questions. As they're getting older, I'm realizing that I'm not in control of their life. They are. And it's horrifying, absolutely horrifying, to have someone you love realize it's up to them to make the good decisions. I can't protect everything. So I've started switching my role as a father to someone who is helping them think through what they want to do. Is that choice bringing them the outcome they want? In schools, we still haven't made that notion. We still kind of clamp them down and control them. But that's been a real teaching experience for me. And then lately, I've been thinking a lot about innovation. So if there's nothing else you walk away with in this talk, I want you to walk away with this idea of what I call a crisis of value. We are not giving people enough opportunity to create value in their life. Most people don't have opportunity where they honestly can experience, I did something that created more value in the world. Sometimes it could be as simple as I created a good dinner and people enjoyed it. Other times it might mean I created a sale and brought more business to my company. But fundamentally, we need to let people create value and find purpose through that process. And school is not often about creating value. It's about consuming value. It's about consuming value that lives in the textbooks with the idea that at some later date, you will get to create value. That promise is very thin for many of the kids today. Very thin. And so we often start with these assumptions of person in deficit, content is great, and value will come later. And we need to switch that to person is great, content in deficit, and value is now. And if we don't make that switch, we're going to start looking for things like gamification to take that awful tasting broccoli, throw a little chocolate on it, and now kids will want to eat it. We need kids to see the value of what they're doing because they want the outcomes. They want to create value in the world. They see themselves as great at doing it, and they are the ones who have to figure out, how do I take this content and do something meaningful with it? Right now, we treat content as king. It is what's great, and if these frickin' kids would just consume it like it's in our textbooks, we'd all be good. But one of the questions back here, content is insufficient in our today's world. Even in the previous world, the way it looks in textbooks is not the way it looks when I use it to create value in the world. I have to translate it. I have to do an innovative act. And so the act of innovation, the real innovator all around us is not the designs that we do. Quest Alliance is awesome, and they built some awesome things. I think I'm pretty awesome sometimes, and we built some awesome things. But the real innovator is the learner. And the innovative act is about them, the innovation they're creating is the integration of those ideas to do some meaningful work in the world. And we don't treat that as profound. We don't treat taking that idea and applying it and using it to do something meaningful as profound. And if we did treat that as profound, we'd start to see kids seeing themselves creating value, thinking of themselves as capable, and thinking about content as enabling them to do great things. And they shouldn't have to figure that out on their own anymore. Maybe in our generation, people didn't care, we just took it. It's not what we're dealing with today. They have to see value now. We have to help kids see, if I do this, this is what it's going to allow. And when I apply it, look at this. Man, I want to take a selfie of me applying it and share it. And I know it's scary for many of us, but having that selfie look cooler, meaning I'm doing a cooler translation act of that thing I'm learning, is really exciting for kids today. So imagine a learning environment in which kids were taking ideas, creating value, sharing that value with others, getting feedback and going, wow, either the value wasn't good or people aren't really engaging in what I'm doing, so I'm going to improve my work. Not for a grade, potentially not just for value, but also because they're connected to a community who wants to give them feedback and say, here's how I created value. So we have a very different opportunity with the technology to make learning look very different in schools. So let me go forward a little bit. I'm also, I didn't mention it, a director of Center for Games and Impact. There's a lot of, because people love games, because they're so pervasive, they think, wow, we got to use those for learning, right? These are going to transform learning. This is the technological fix we've been waiting for. Now we can fix those broken kids and those broken learning systems, and it will be great, right? So we've done a lot of work, and part of the reasons why we think games are valuable is not just because they're fun. You know, people were like, kids won't even know they're learning. Wow, that's a travesty. We need kids to know exactly why they're learning, want the outcomes of it, and engage it deeply. A really good gamer is not someone who doesn't know why they're doing what they're doing. They're someone who cares so deeply about the outcome that they'll work all frickin' night long, including sneaking their phone, their laptop, or whatever they're working on into their bedroom to play better, to skill up, and use data to improve their performance. So for me, a good gamer is an engaged and purposeful learner who's seeking data to improve their performance so they can achieve the goal that they value. But many people think about gamification as tricking people, that the gamification is going to take responsibility for the unmotivated learner. What we need to do is help people care about why they're learning and what they're going to do with it. And that's what's got to drive them. The gamification is giving them feedback about progress, not making them want the goal. Does that make sense a little bit? And I know for fanboys or fangirls of gaming is going to transform things, that can be a little disconcerting. But it's not the game that's great, again, it's the player that's great. Right? When we are leveraging games for impact, for education, for learning goals, the game is a service. And a lot of the game designers forget that. They go, wow, doesn't my game look beautiful? I don't really care if it looks beautiful. I care about how the player feels and how they look when they're trying to use what they're learning through your game. And that switch from games as products to game as service has been a really hard one for us, who spent 15 years building these beautiful products, and I'll walk through. So part of the power of games is you can step into different roles in different worlds. You can make choices and explore the consequences. You get a delicate balance of challenges and rewards. You can advance at your own pace. You can fail in a safe and supported environment. You can develop knowledge just in time. You can iterate your performance based on feedback. And you can use this knowledge to develop mastery. Awesome stuff, right? But these are what makes games powerful, are these things that are going on in the game, not the beautiful design of the game. The beautiful design of the game sometimes creates the interest and gets people to want to share their performance. So some of the games that we've designed can look like this, just to give you a taste. So in these games, often you are a player, you are the protagonist of a game. In this game, it's about water quality. There's a map, There's different things going on in these rivers. Some areas are polluted and some are less polluted. Fish are dying. When you log into the game, the first things that happens is someone says, oh, thank goodness you're here. We've been waiting for you. Fish are dying, we don't know why, and we hear you know how to help us. And I can put in the game, well, I'm not, oh, no, don't be so humble. You're gonna help us fix this problem. And if the game is designed right, I make choices and I see how those choices affect people even emotionally when we talk about the socio-emotional learning before. But also I can collect data, I can analyze water, and if it's really designed well, the only way I can succeed is if I understand the core concepts that we're trying to teach. So this is a science water quality game, if I don't know what the concept of eutrophication is where you have fertilizer runoff going into a water, you have algae blooms, and then when they die, they use up all the dissolved oxygen in the water, and fish choke because they don't have dissolved oxygen. If I don't understand that, I can collect all this data, I can build these arguments, but I can't succeed and move the narrative forward. So now we've taken content that often is in a textbook to be memorized, a definition, and we've made it enable someone to achieve a goal they're invested in the game. And the power of the game world is we've designed the entire world to be pedagogically useful. So when you make bad choices, it knows and it can tell you that's not really making sense. And then what we do in the games we design is we have pieces of the game that are in HTML. And the reason why that's important is the same tool I'm using in the game, I can use outside of the game. And I can continue to iterate on those ideas in my classroom, even in other places where I have access to HTML. Here's another game we did with preparing pre-service teachers. And in this case, at Arizona State University, one of the big problems we had was the theory to practice move. People would learn a lot in the classroom, but then when they went out into their schools, they didn't know how to apply it. So one of the big things we were able to do is we were taking the ideas that were nice in theory, but we were able to embed these teachers in actual simulations where they were working with students and they were seeing the effects of their action on those students. And you might think, wow, that would be so much cooler to go out into the classroom and work with real students. Totally. But the power of these games is they had shared students, so they could all do different things and have conversations about, wow, your student revised their essay? Mine didn't revise their essay. What did you tell them? And they would go back and look and they would see, wow, when all you do is try to increase the ability of the student in your feedback, and you don't simultaneously build confidence and a commitment to revise, they don't resubmit. What a concept, right? So now teachers are playing a game where they're making choices about what feedback to give a student on their work. And you think the right chance is to tell them what they did wrong in their work, and you're all excited because you looked at the work and you figured it out. But if you tell people too quickly just what's wrong and not what's right, and not why revising their work is important and what they're not communicating from what they did, what you get is you get an increase in ability, but a tanking in ability and confidence. In confidence and commitment. I'll just skip ahead of this one just for time, since we lost that. So what you see over here is I'm in here, I'm talking with students, I'm looking at their work, and based on the choices I make, I can increase ability, but I can lower confidence or commitment, right? So we can start to take some of the ideas that we want to communicate and take implicit ideas and make them very explicit to our learner, which is very powerful. I'll just skip over this one quickly. This was something we did for the MacArthur Foundation, and it was based on the situation in Uganda where you have people being kidnapped, forced to take up arms, and then they're trying to kind of, now that they've pushed the LRA out a little bit, they're trying to help the country heal. And the question they wanted us to think about was, do you need justice before you can have peace after a human rights violation has occurred? And so as we went around and we talked to people, justice was one choice. You can't see these really well. Amnesty was another one, which was look the other way. And many people thought that Uganda, when they decided to not press charges and not pursue and let the criminal sanctions come in, where guns would come in from the international criminal courts and start to seek out the LRA, that they were just looking the other way. And when they interviewed President Museveni and they talked with him about decisions, he said, well, here in Uganda, we want to practice forgiveness. And people are like, well, you can't just do amnesty and look the other way. And he said, no, forgiveness is something very different, because it's the one act where the perpetrator, where the victim has power to grant something to the perpetrator. The only reason why I'm sharing it to you is to say that these games aren't just trivial ideas. You can really explore big notions in these spaces. Bring kind of all that to closure. What we found in our work is kind of what you just heard in the last talk, which is that when you have a bounded game and it's not supplemented with other instruction, when you don't have multiple facilitator training sessions, and hugely, when you don't have students talking to each other about the things they're doing in the game, you don't get the big learning gains that you do when you have those three things. So again, it is not a technological fix, right? It is one tool within a classroom ecosystem when there's other instruction, multiple facilitator, and other players working in groups to talk around the game that is very powerful. But what we found in the outcomes, it's not what happens in the game, it's what happens around the game within the classroom. So people would say, well, then your games don't really you say that your games are showing learning gains in these comparison studies, but it's really all of these things. And I'm like, yeah, it's all these things, right? And I think that's great. I think that giving more tools, not trying to replace, is really powerful. The biggest issue we've had after working with these spaces with hundreds of thousands of kids all over the world, I've traveled all over and watched ecosystems implement them, is the problem of transfer. What you see is you see really powerful learning and it goes on for about a month, but then you don't see real change in these kids' lives. So I gave them an opportunity to feel of value within a virtual world, but they weren't able to translate that to feeling value in the real world. And I've seen that throughout my career as a drug counselor. We'd have these great therapy groups with kids. They would realize what the problem was. They would talk about it. They would even start to believe they have something different. We put them back in the world, and they're back doing drugs again, even living in those same situations. So one of the problems we have is not, can we create a virtual space where someone can find value, but can we help people find value in the real world? Can we reorient our schools, our learning platforms, our relationships between the learners and the world in which they sit in ways that let kids create value, even in schools? It's a real challenge that we have in front of us, and I think it's a real opportunity. And so one of the big things that I'm trying to push is that the learner, not our games, but the learner must become the innovator, and their work must become the innovation. So we have a notion of anticipatory governance at the Future of Innovation Society. Anticipatory governance. It's not about the technology or about the big idea. It's about the individual who's leveraging it, anticipating what I might do with this thing. And then they govern the relationship between the idea as it's formed in the textbook or the technology and the goals they want to bring about. And the real power and the real challenge is in the integration, not in the engineering. And I think that's the same problem we have in schools. We overvalue the content and we undervalue the anticipation of what I'm going to do with it and supporting them in the hard integration process of doing it. And as soon as you start shifting your learning from what it is to what people are going to do with it, your entire curriculum changes. So when I walk into a group and we're going to build a new learning journey, we're going to build interest-driven pathways, I say the place to start is I flip everything on the head. I say, well, what do you want people to do at the end? Let's just sit down right now and create 5 or 10 stories of what you want your learners to be able to do when they're done with your curriculum. This is backwards design. Now we start building the missions, the quests, the trajectories, the content, the PDFs, the videos in support of helping kids be able to do that. But it's not project-based learning. We can't wait 4 weeks until they finish their project. We need them to have releases right away, like within the first 2 hours. So we start rethinking curriculum in what I call an invite, enable, release methodology. What I mean by invite is we want to invite people into thinking right in the beginning what they're going to do with that which they're learning. And the way that the platforms that we build do that is we let them connect with other people's stories, other people's releases. Then, as they're forming these ideas about what they want to create, then the content that we're so excited about comes in to enable them to have the release that they're now invested in. And it's a very different way of building curriculum. I'm going to jump into the next part of it now. Do I have any questions at this point? Are people feeling at all like, hey, I want to say something yet? Or should I just keep going? You can be bothered by something. You can be curious. Yeah, and part of what I'm going to get to is, yeah, we have the games and you can download, and we have the new platforms that we're building, and you can connect with those. We do not, the games that we have right here are not offline. We do have some board games that are offline, but the games that I'm showing today are not offline. Yeah, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. A lot of the conversation that we had with Quest Alliance yesterday was, what does it mean to set up intranet servers where you can have local communities working together, working on the activities, sharing their stories, collaborating, and they're all doing it through a local connection, so they're not having to go to the internet, but they can go within a school environment. And I think the power of central hubs where people can come together and share their ideas and support them is really wonderful. And I think Quest Alliance is kind of leading in how they're thinking about creating pockets of innovation where people can come together and share their work. So you don't have to be offline or online. You have to be kind of locally online. Yeah, so that's where I'm getting to next.
Yeah, and which is what Gandhi promised and provided basic education, the famous Night Talim. But his method is completely outdated today.
Yeah.
So how do you try, how do stakeholders actually make an attempt to revive such wonderful formal education?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to get to some of that answer. So the question is, yeah, we get the ideas. They're kind of interesting. I like the idea of people are working together, working on projects, sharing them. But the models that we have right now are outdated, and they're not working within the context that we're all living in. And so we need some new models, and I'm going to talk about those. It's a great question.
Basically learn through games or games for change. So one thing that I want to understand through the games that you guys have created, from the trackable data, are you guys able to track data which are related to problem solving, that kids who spend time on these games become better problem solvers, or like the soft skills which are not trackable generally in the academics or the content that we provide in the school? Through these games, are you able to do it? Or is these games are facilitating these 5 C's or 21st century skills in some way?
Yeah, so I'll use this as my transition to continue on a little bit. So most of the funding that we got were focused on hard skill kind of development where young kids, for example, could see themselves as engineers, as artists, as writers, as doctors. And so we had to really demonstrate hard skill learning in the comparison studies. And it's very rare that I hear, well, what about soft skill learning, the hard skills that we want to show? So we were kind of proud with those. We have not done a lot of data collection and analysis on soft skills. So I can kind of talk about individual stories, and I have thousands of those stories, not 5 or 6, but we have not done focus studies on ongoing, what I would call socio-emotional learning capabilities as they go through. But I think that you kind of both hinted an issue. One of the things with these games is that they're bounded, right? They exist for a couple hours. I go in, I feel great, I succeed in them, but then when I leave, I'm back to my real life, and it's kind of, in some ways, a little bit more off-putting because I can see the contrast so glaringly. In the game world, I can be incredible. In the real world, I kind of can't succeed, and I'm not really even supposed to create value. I'm just supposed to consume it, again, in this class. And my voice isn't really what matters here. It's my ears that matter, right? And my ability to match you. So I want to start with a notion of kind of one walk away up to this point is we need to shift our assumptions to person as innovator, not person in deficit. To content as enabling, not content as containing value. Right? I think content there's a potential in it, but it's got to be released by the player. And it's got to be released in a world that is very different than the conditions that the content looks like in the textbook. And some of you even said some of the content that we're teaching isn't even related to the releases they need. I want to think about learning as thriving, not acquiring content. And what I mean by thriving is I'm actually doing things in the world with it. I'm actually having successes, achieving goals. And when you start to think about that as the goal, you go, wow, how do I even build a platform, a context to support that kind of thing? I want you to think about technology not as a fix, but as an amplifier. So lots of people have real passions that they walk around with. They really want to do things, and we need to think about how we leverage technology to connect them to what they want to do, to bring the content they need and the people that they need to support them in achieving those goals, and then to giving them feedback about where they need to improve. And I want you to think about innovation. When you do cool things in innovation, it's not about disseminating that. It's about allowing it to be locally integrated in each ecosystem. And when you do that, you start to privilege the ecosystem, not the technology. So, wow, that didn't really come through. I tried to talk a lot about the focus is on the release. We want to start with what people are doing it. When you look at a Nike ad today, in Nike, you don't see their product all over. What you see is people doing really cool things, and every once in a while, you'll see the swish go by. Companies over and over are talking about themselves not as products, but as platforms, as spaces that are connecting people to the goals they want, not as providing solutions. And I'm starting to get to that answer that you asked about. We need to stop thinking about our content using a pipeline methodology. Pipeline thinking is people have to work their way up your chain. And when they get high up into it, it's great. And when you have a pipeline methodology, you have to build all the value. I have to go get all those taxi cabs, create them, get the insurance, get all those forms set, hire my people, have a place where they can meet, set up a number where people can call in. Uber didn't do any of it. They don't even have a product. But they're enabling all kinds of people to get to where they need to, and they're enabling all kinds of people who have time and who can feel value by giving people a ride, and they can make some money doing it, right? It's very different. Airbnb. Man, think about what some of these beautiful hotel chains have built. Then comes Airbnb. What we're going to do to help people succeed is connect people who are looking for a room to people who want to make their room available. So we're starting to see a shift from we build solutions and we have value and you come experience it, to you all create solutions and we're going to use platforms and algorithms to connect people to the services they want and to let anyone on our systems create value, not just us. So when we start thinking about that value doesn't have to just come from the textbook, but other people can create value, we start to get a different, imagine if we start having anyone who has skills to share, anyone who has capacities that they can support someone else in building, that they can easily make that available to your student, to the learner. It's a different way of thinking about things. It's not about we build up the schools, but it's about we connect and support people in finding value and connecting with the people who help them succeed, right? And the teacher's role becomes less as gatekeeper. And they're becoming in a much more helping people connect to things, helping them make sense where they're struggling, helping support them in finding, well, what you want to do is this. Some of that can be done by algorithms, but a lot of the companies also have people that look at the data and really connect people and support them. And we'll talk more about that. So when you think about invite, enable, release, when we think about learning, what we want to start to do is think about people, what do I want to accomplish? What do I want to do? And so that the invitation, a lot of times when we think about fixing people, we think about interventions, things we put into people. Invitations are things we invite you to do. And then there's this dance of agency where you have structure and agency, and you're kind of in a dance with the learner, not trying to curtail their own investment in what they're trying to achieve. And so right now what I'm trying to kind of put new goals for thinking about what does it mean to have a really powerful, thriving ecosystem. And I'll show you, so we are building a platform right now, and we are working with Quest Alliance to think about what that partnership can look like as we go forward. But imagine an advertisement for school or for a learning platform to look more like this, where the shift is not about, you can bring up the volume a little bit, just a little bit. So there's a little gamification, but the focus is you're the innovation. Imagining your future by reacting to stories of what other people have done who are a part of this learning group. And when you react, they get data that you inspired them. You're leveling up your skills to create positive impact in the world by achieving goals that you value as you work on them. Very different than the way curriculum looks. And then you're inspiring others through your successes and your failures by sharing your stories and they're connecting to them. And we're thinking about learning as your journey, not about getting your grade or walking through the chapters. So we have an opportunity and we have technologies and we have kind of new ways of thinking about unlocking human potential that would focus much differently on this is what the content is and much more on this is what you're going to be and this is what you're going to be able to do. So imagine a kid walking into 3rd grade and seeing that and going, wow, what am I going to achieve? What am I going to build? What am I going to do? What stories am I going to create? What opportunities am I going to unlock? And so we need a system that allows for that dance of agency because we have structures. We know a lot of stuff. And a lot of us can't let kids go wherever they want to go because when you're in my class, we're going to focus on journeys related to whatever science content that's really important to us. But we need to repackage that content into things that kids can achieve and do and are excited to share with each other, which in the sharing of each other in today's generation, sharing what I just accomplished in ways that get feedback from you is really powerful motivator for learning. Really powerful. And then when I reach out and I help you and I get reputational assets out of that relationship, we're both supporting meaningful relationships where kids are helping each other. We're helping the ideas that are in our textbook come to life. And we're letting new ideas be born every week, kind of as new stories are created by different ecosystems. And so we've been thinking about, a lot of people talk about gamification. And what I've been trying to introduce is this idea of thrivification. Thrivification is a focus on how do I get to do more things successfully. And it starts with imagining futures from which I grow potential to create the impact that I value, and then I have to inspire others. So imagine if your report card looked at a subject and talked about how are you imagining different futures? How are you growing potentials? Your kid grew a lot of potential and imagined a lot of cool things in this area, but really didn't really excel over here. I'm not sure why. And what are the impacts you're creating, and how are you inspiring others? And if in order to get I'll even call it like a micro certificate. We have big courses, big certifications. We need to bring those way down in scale. They're too large right now, entire courses that take months to complete. And we need to let people have success in much more bite-sized chunks. So we need to kind of bring it all the way back to what are the stories we want kids to create. And then from that, we need to build out kind of opportunities that are manageable, that they can achieve. And we need to leave a little bit of agency in how they do that work. Very, very hard in traditional classes where you have 120 to 1, right? 120 kids with one teacher over the course of a day. So kind of what I wanted to leave you, so we're going to do a couple workshops and you're going to be able to play some of the platforms we've been doing. And through the partnership with Quest Alliance, we're going to be able to try to make more of these available. And one of the big things that we've done is try to make it really easy for anyone to build quests that allow people to go through the stages of imagine, grow, create, inspire, as opposed to us. So right now we're coming in with content because we just kind of got the green light to build this engine and kind of start to experiment with it. And when you look in the world today of industry and technology, they talk about thin and light and agile. So we don't want to build something for 30 years. What you want to do is get enough features that the vision you have, in this case around imagine, grow, create, inspire, where people are working together, sharing stories, producing things of value that teachers even find useful. You want to create it as light as you can and then get people like you giving us feedback to help us grow and make it great, which is very different than like, we're about to have this solution. We're going to give me one more year and we're going to throw it out there. So the relationship that we're trying to introduce today is we have some really powerful ideas of what learning should look like. We have very clear notions that we want the kid to be the innovator, and we want their learning to be an act of innovation where they find value in the world. And what we want to work with you is growing the platforms and the ecosystems that allow that to happen at scale. So part of what I wanted to do during this keynote was give you some new ideas to think about. And then I also wanted to extend an invitation to be working with us and over the next year or so, the platforms that we're making available to think through how we can find, kind of actually implement new models where learners are really finding value in how they're learning. I think that I've highlighted the learning as innovation, the teaching as invitation a little bit, not just as making claims, a little bit about technology as platform as opposed to technology as pipeline. A lot of our games were based more on a pipeline mentality, and the platform stuff we're trying to do is let people play with success in the real world in a supportive community. There's two final thoughts I want to leave you with. One is this idea of relationships catalyze growth. I've spent a lot of time building ecosystems, building platforms, building really powerful technologies. And what I've seen is that some of the biggest moments where a kid decides to lean forward and try something new, or to take a risk, or to achieve success, is bound up in relationships. The relationships with mentors, with teachers, and with peers. And sometimes they're relationships with like younger brothers who they're helping and all of a sudden they feel like they have value. Relationships are key, and so a big part of the platforms that we're doing are about forming relationships and having one person be able to champion the growth of another. So when we talk about inspiring others, part of that is by sharing your work, part of that is helping them succeed. So in the platforms, as soon as I have success and someone else connects it with it, I get an email or a text so that I can respond and say, hey, how can I help back? That's cool that you like what I did. So that's one concept. The other one is this dance of agency. I'm not in any way suggesting that we give up our responsibility to build really powerful learning experiences. We have to. We know a lot, and we don't want every new generation to make it up, right? But I want you to think a lot about a dance of agency where your structure is interacting with their passion. And it's got to start with the invitation. It can't start with your content. It's got to start with the learner leaning forward and wanting to go after it. And then the structure is incredibly powerful. But if you impose the structure too quickly, it's going to become an act of compliance. And I don't care how beautiful your structure is. Acts of compliance don't have long-term outcomes. They might have short-term outputs where you get nice high scores, but long-term outcomes require some kind of investment, and the individual learner has to find value. And if you look at the development industry, outputs and outcomes all over, they're finding this. You can maximize fertilizers, dependencies, grants. You can maximize yields very quickly. But if you want long-term outcomes, you need a different kind of ecosystem implementation. And it's not one that's about efficiency. It's really one about empowerment. So hopefully that gave you some, the goal of a keynote for me is to give you some really big ideas, but then hopefully, if all goes well, create an invitation where you want more and want to engage in conversations and maybe even partner as we go forward with some of the work we're doing. So any more questions?
Hi, I'm Deepak from Anudeep Foundation. So we train large numbers of people from rural backgrounds, young people, for jobs in the digital economy.
Yeah.
And one of the things we find is very critical for the job isn't there in the young person, is the sense of curiosity. We're born curious, and then it's beaten out of us by teachers, by parents, by book-based learning. And you need that for, innovative jobs. Have you had, or would you want to talk a little bit about how you reawaken curiosity in young people?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not saying that these principles and these things I've talked about solve what you're going to do tomorrow. But what I'm saying is that they're creating a very different set of assumptions from which you need to find your solutions, right? So if we start with the idea that learning involves this idea of kind of imagining possibility, well, that's all about curiosity. And it's amazing when you get that passion, you get people that don't know as much working harder after the class leaves, and they can make up that difference. But if you don't get that passion, and part of that passion comes with, I'm not just doing what you did. It involves, I'm getting to have my own unique sense of purpose. So we were up in Udaipur, Anna and I, when we were traveling. And in Udaipur, there's a lot of painters, right? And there's a lot of them who do these mini, what do you call it? What's the word? The real fine detail painting, the miniatures. And every time, as you're a foreigner, you get brought into these shops constantly, right? Constantly. And it's always interesting to hear the different ways that they position why their value is unique to other shops. But what's consistent throughout in Udaipur, in part because there's a sense that we were never colonized and we have a real pride up here, which is really interesting as you talk with people there, that even when they're reproducing a miniature, the particular expression is their ability aligned through God's purpose for them, right? So yes, I'm reproducing, but I'm also having a little bit of creativity, and when I start, I'm kind of curious what's going to come out, right? And that notion, I was like, wow, what do you mean you're kind of curious what comes out of it? Well, remember, this painting is a collaboration between what's been done before me, between my particular ability, and between what God wants. I was like, well, that's interesting. What if kids really felt like when they were learning, they were having the opportunity to bring their purpose in line with the big ideas in a form that created unique value in the world? And I think that's where the curiosity is wow. And it's got to start with a belief that I can do something. It's very hard to be curious when you have no sense that you can ever even engage the idea meaningfully. And what I want people to be curious is, what am I going to do with this thing I'm learning? What's going to be my unique expression of it? So when I'm learning digital literacy, I'm not just learning about, digital footprint as a safety mechanism, which I think is really important, but I'm also learning, what is the digital presence and footprint that I'm going to create, and what is that going to do for me? I better also think about what is it not going to do for me, and what does it mean to have my data captured and all these other issues. But I need to get people being curious about, if I reach out and learn this thing, because everyone deserves to believe that the time they invest in learning will allow them to do great things. But those great things have to start with their curiosity. So I think it's essential. If you don't capture that imagination and that curiosity right in the beginning, it becomes a rote exercise. The growing isn't really growing, it's consuming, right? And when learning is about consuming content, it doesn't go long term. We were looking at this recent study about valedictorians that just came out. And Anna was reading it to me. She's like, it's very interesting. These valedictorians, who are the most successful students in schools at the time they're students, right? What they looked at them is what's happened to them 20 years later. And very, very infrequently did these valedictorians do something really interesting in their life, in their professional world. Very infrequently. And I think a big part of it is because a great student is not necessarily someone who has creativity and imagination. There's someone who knows very clearly how to reproduce what's expected of them and demonstrate it in the form that that test is asking for, which is a skill. But it doesn't prepare you for a world that's constantly changing, where everything's in flux. Even our curriculum's in flux, right? I didn't want to get into it, but schools are changing. Curriculum's becoming unbundled. Technology is now mediating so many of our interactions. Assessments are changing. You were asking me about higher order skills. God, everybody asks me about, what about the hard skills? And now people are asking about ongoing skills. They're talking about things like disposition, things like mind state, right? These are all new concepts in there. So I don't know, I over-answered your question.
Hi, Sasha. This is
Hello.
Krisha. My question is a little long. 15 years back when I was studying, I have seen my fellow students from government schools in India struggle. They're brilliant students, but they struggled because the proficiency in the English language. And when they were going for further studies, be it engineering, be it doctors, all the books were in English, right? So they struggled in that. 5 years back, even we spoke about Chinese market and Japanese market, how they have improved and gone better just by focusing in their language. But today, even they are including English. There's a huge importance of it bringing English in there because globalization is happening. Now, in India, we have 23 different languages. Now, what we're speaking about being the gamification or anything, it can't be done in 23 different languages. In your experience, have you worked in similar situation where this variety of local languages are there? How would you have you experienced it? What's the overcome and how we go about it?
Yeah. I mean, so I am not an expert in English language learning in any form, so let's start with that assumption. What I can say is that not just the language of the content, the growing stuff, but the value that one finds is local. And as long as we have standardized kind of concepts that we're just throwing out that everybody needs to know in the very same way, the problems go beyond language. It's very hard for everybody to find the same value when they're learning and growing and trying to use the ideas. So my bias is allow more decentralized success stories where people are working together in their communities to find value in what's around them, because A, they can contribute directly to what's happening, so they can rise their local ecosystem. With that said, it's just so hard to know for me in India what's necessary to have a success in life. I don't know enough. Like, if you don't know Hindi, is that going to really screw you over at some point in trying to find a competitive job that's value? I don't know. So I'm not the best. What I can say is if I'm constantly told that everything that's of value is someone else's culture, someone else's language, someone else's history, someone else's success stories, it starts to do a lot of really negative work on the learner themselves. And they don't start to see themselves as filled. They see themselves as in deficit. They see their parents in deficit. They see their culture and their community in deficit. And then all they want to do is get out, right? And that's not a healthy thing to start with. We really need to start with people's feet on the ground, finding value first in who they are and what they were born with, and then continuing to grow that value on. So I would say, I would kind of do it in layers rather than just say, oh, you're going to learn everything new in there. But I am not an expert in that field. There's maybe many experts in here. We'll go here first and then in the back. 2 minutes, okay. So you don't get a question then. We'll go there and there.
Hi, my name is Kishan. So there's some research that shows that for transfer, which is so difficult to happen, one thing that's so important is the metacognition, the self-reflection, the thinking about thinking that students need to go through. In your games, have you found or given students opportunity to do that, for example, without breaking the immersiveness of those games? Yeah.
So the question was, transfer is really important, and we find that everywhere. Knowing universals doesn't allow you to engage particulars. Also in the literature, metacognition does not fix that problem. So how do we fix the problem? If it's not, I know an idea and then I know why I know the idea. What we need to do is we need to position learning in lots of particulars. So Aristotle, who some would argue was a great educational philosopher, talked about, we teach universals, but the problem is wisdom comes from particulars. And as long as we continue to focus on big universal ideas, even with layers of metacognition, we'll never get wise people in the world. We just need to give people more experience with particulars. So I would argue we don't win, and adding a layer of metacognition doesn't win. We need to transform where learning happens so it actually happens in the places where you use it. Right? Then you don't have transfer. The problem goes away. Just like when working with recovering addicts, we're helping them build success stories, not in the rehabs, but out in their life and their communities where they're, and so the platforms that we use look more like phones than they do big desktops, because they need to go with them where they need them. And so we've had to do a lot. I mean, for me, it's been a whole big way of thinking mobile first. And the reason why I've been doing mobile first is in part access, but in part because I need learning to occur. I need to get the support, the ideas, the growth when I'm out there in the world doing things, right? Not when I go back, I think about it, and then I apply it. So I guess it's not a good answer. I guess both solutions lose unless we kind of get rid of the problem altogether by not making transfer a requirement. Last question.
Hi, I am Sandesh from Enable India. Usually we work with person with disability to gain the economic independence and dignity. My question is, how do you decide that every learner require different, kind of environment to learn? And also one more question is that every sessions usually will be differ. How do you enable the facilitator to observe what in the environment? How do you develop that skills to facilitate to observe that particular skills to give the feedback to the during the games kind of?
Yeah. So let me be clear. I don't think every learner needs a different environment. I think every learner needs to feel like they are creating value for them. And that looks different often in different environments. I think that learning, so let me get there quickly. Right now, a lot of times what you're doing with content is memorizing it and demonstrating it on a test. When we start switching the focus of the learning moment to creating value, what we want is kids building things. And I don't just mean coding. It can be representations of arguments, of stories, of relationships with good conversation, of picking up trash, of analyzing water quality, whatever it is. We need to create more ways of kids taking images and expressing themselves, creating value, and then teachers can give feedback on that creating value, right? And we need to think about my representation of my value creation not as the end goal, but as a continual process where I can iterate that to get better. So right now, often kids will submit a thing and it's over. You get your grade. But that's not, like, we need to let kids submit and iterate and iterate and iterate. Now, teachers don't have a lot of time, so we need to bring other people into the conversation, like peers who are responsible for giving you feedback because they just succeeded with that thing. So long story is, I think it's really important that we start to make the kinds of things that we create visible in ways that teachers can facilitate, have insight, see where the problems are, see what's going on. I don't know if I got to your question. I thought I did when I started, but now I don't feel like I did. You can ask me more outside in the hall, how's that, if I didn't quite cover it. So I think I should stop there. Yes. Thank you. Hopefully that was useful.